Hi, everybody. My name is Henry Pollock, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Illinois. And today I'm going to be talking about some research from my previous postdoc looking at avian responses to the landscape of fear on Guam. So I just want to quickly acknowledge all of the universities that were and institutions that were involved in the collection of this data. And I also want to thank all my co-authors, of which there were many, and field crews without whom this research would not have been possible. And then finally, I'd also like to thank all of the people who helped with logistics and all of our funding sources, which you see here on the right. So as we're all familiar with, Guam's avifauna, Guam used to be home to a diverse and interesting avifauna, and following the introduction of the brown tree snake after World War II, this avifauna was absolutely decimated by this invasive predator. So you kind of see the results of that in these graphs from Wiles et al. 2003. You can see these vertical red dashed lines represent kind of when a lot of these populations started declining, which was around the late 70s to early 80s. And you can see that each of these panels corresponds to a species on the left. And you can see how those precipitously dropped off right around the 1980 mark, leaving behind this kind of ragtag bunch of birds on Guam, some of which are native and some of which are introduced and which are going to be the focus of the rest of this talk. So why did the tree snake have such devastating impacts on Guam's avifauna? There are a few different reasons, but one of the big ones is that they're nocturnal. And so this is a time period when all of these bird species are resting and are more vulnerable to predation. They're also quite cryptic, as many of the BTS texts can probably attest to. It's tough to find these guys, even when they're active at night. And finally, they're a novel predator. And so there were no native snakes on Guam, and most of Guam's birds were ecologically naive to snakes in general. And so because of these different factors, the brown tree snake absolutely decimated Guam's bird populations. And what we're trying to understand in this talk is how are Guam's remaining birds coping with this invasive predator? And so I want to introduce this idea of the landscape of fear, which is going to be the focus for the rest of this talk. And this is essentially to understand how prey respond to predators on the landscape. And the idea is that prey can perceive and respond to spatial variation and predation risks to minimize their risk of getting eaten. And so what you see here in this figure is on the left, this is a predator-free area where prey are free to do as they please. You have the second scenario, which are direct consumptive effects of predators eating prey. And then finally, you have this landscape of fear scenario. So these fear effects are behaviorally mediated, they're non-lethal, but essentially it's how prey change their behavior to reduce the risk of being eaten by a predator. And a really nice framework for understanding the landscape of fear was proposed by Gaynor et al. In 2018. And so you start with these sort of physical landscape factors which influence predation risk. There are also aspects of prey and predator biology which influence predation risk. And then these two combine to another prerequisite is that there must be the actual ability to perceive that sort of variation in predation risk at the prey level. And so if you take all of those different factors, those factors then create the landscape of fear, which influences the responses of prey. And these responses can be spatiotemporal, they can be behavioral. So we're going to be talking a lot about some of these behavioral sort of responses. So are birds more vigilant? Are they grouping together more to reduce predation risk and stuff like that? And so the two main questions we wanted to address were just simply where do snakes forage and where do birds roost? And then secondarily, are birds exhibiting sort of adaptive responses to the predation risk imposed by the tree snakes? So again, we wanted to look at some of these possible behavioral responses to the landscape of fear. So the first question we addressed with a case study with Såli, or Micronesian starlings. You can see fledgling Såli here in the bottom left, and we use radio telemetry. So we put radio transmitters on about 45 individuals, evenly spread across different age classes. And I just quickly want to orient you to these different age classes. First of all, fledglings are young birds that are still dependent on the parents. When they reach about 3 weeks of age, they disperse from the natal territory, and then they're in the juvenile phase. And you can see they're a little bit lighter and streakier. They have yellow eyes, and they're independent at this phase, but not reproductive. And finally, when they become capable of breeding, they attain this adult glossy black plumage, which is probably the most familiar to all of us. So again, we tagged a lot of these different age classes. We got 430 locations, and we also tagged a lot of snakes in the same area. So we conducted this research at Anderson Air Force Base to see how these sort of prey and predators were cohabitating together. And what we found, first of all, was that in terms of where the birds are roosting, they are roosting almost exclusively in the urban area. So you can kind of see that across all these age classes, independent of age, they all are kind of flooding into this urban area and spending the night there. And presumably this is because snakes are less abundant and predation risk is lower in urban areas, as snakes tend to prefer forested habitats. However, what we also found was that a lot of these snakes were residing in the urban area. So these are snakes that we caught originally in the urban area, and they are mostly staying in the urban area. And so again, these are refugia to a certain extent, but they're still dangerous in the sense that snakes are still around. And so we wanted to then understand, oh, I should also mention that we wanted to look at how these predator prey were overlapping on this landscape. So what you see here are sort of the overlaid GPS locations. And you can see that the black circles are areas of high overlap where birds and snakes are kind of in the same small area. And then there are also areas of little overlap, which are indicated by the green circles. So what I want you to take away from here is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the landscape and sort of predation risk. In some areas are higher risk and some areas are lower risk. Finally, I just want to contextualize the sort of urban roosting by showing that most birds, especially juveniles, spend most of their time in the forest during the day. So these are forest birds, and on other islands in Marianas, they tend to spend most of their time in the forest, and they make the sort of mass exodus out of the forest at night to roost in the safer urban area. So again, these are forested birds that are exhibiting the sort of shift apparently to these safer urban areas at night to reduce predation risk. We also wanted to look at, given there was so much overlap in some of these areas, we also wanted to look at sort of microhabitat responses and see where these birds and snakes were hanging out in microhabitat level. So to do this, we first looked at sort of the height distributions of the different age classes, and what we found was that older birds tend to roost in higher parts of trees. Fledglings are pretty clumsy. They're somewhat sedentary, and so they generally just kind of camp out at the first lower branches of trees that they're hanging out in. And interestingly, snakes were also found sort of lower in trees. So in terms of most least vulnerable, fledglings seem to be at sort of these more vulnerable lower heights in trees. In terms of what substrates birds were using, we found that there were these sort of shifts as birds got older. So Såli that were older tend to use coconut palms, which you see here in blue, and you can see this big increase in coconuts as they age. And when you compare to what the snakes are doing, you can see that the snakes don't use coconut palms very often. Coconuts are difficult to climb and kind of a high energy cost. And so this seems to suggest that as birds get older, they're getting better at avoiding snakes on the microhabitat level. And so in terms of most to least vulnerable, again, the sort of axis of vulnerability, fledglings are sort of most vulnerable in terms of where and what trees they're actually hanging out in relative to what the snakes are doing. And importantly, when you look at this related to survival, so we also calculated survival rates using marker capture models, you find that survival of older birds is much higher. So adults, by using these coconut palms, apparently are able to escape predation to a large extent, whereas younger birds, which are using more dense trees like casuarinas and calophyllums, those birds are getting hit a lot more by the snakes. So what this suggests is that birds may be able to, Såli might be able to sort of develop this behavioral mechanism of avoiding predation as they age. Finally, we also wanted to look at the entire roosting bird community at Anderson Air Force Base. So this kind of, these are the 6 bird species that are largely comprised the bird community there. And with my collaborator Ovidio Jaramillo in 2018, we went out and we surveyed every single tree in the urban area of Anderson Air Force Base to just see where birds were roosting and if there were sort of spatial patterns and any other patterns of sort of landscape of fear effects. And so you can see all these trees here on the left, these little black dots. We sampled over 800 trees, and we also sampled each tree multiple times. And what we found was that 31% of all trees had birds present. So these birds are all fleeing the forested area at night, and they're all cramming themselves into the urban area. And they're kind of just jamming themselves into these trees in the center of the urban area. We also found evidence of social aggregation. So as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the main possible landscape of fear responses. When species aggregate together, can give them a dilution effect, sort of safety in numbers simply. Also, it could be providing a sentinel effect. So it might be easier to detect predators if there are more eyes around in the roost. And we found that these roosts varied in size, but some of them were absolutely massive, containing up to 5 species and over 150 individuals in these roosts. And you can also see that there's a spatial pattern here whereby the communal roosts are concentrated right in the center of the urban area. And when you compare this to control trees, you find significant differences in distance from forests. So these birds are seeming to avoid the forest edge. When you look at individual species patterns of these 6 species, you see that they recapitulate the sort of communal roost patterns. So you see that for most species, they're clumped together in the center of the urban area, and there's a sort of wide perimeter around the edge of the forest that they're just not roosting in at all. This is true of all these different species. You find concordant spatial patterns of predator avoidance because, as I mentioned, snakes are more abundant in the forest. And there's one exception, though. The dove, the island collared dove here in the bottom right, seems to have a much broader roosting distribution and seems to not be as heavily impacted by the presence of the tree snake. And so we think this has to do with body size. If you look at body mass here on the x-axis, relation to the proportion of communal roost used, you can see that as species get larger, there's a really strong relationship, negative relationship with the sort of sociality. So they're using communal roosts less often when they're larger. And again, this is independent of their origin, so whether they were introduced or native. And what seems to be happening here is that larger bird species are likely able to escape predation or have reduced predation risk. And so they don't exhibit such strong spatial patterns of forest avoidance as these smaller species and such strong need for communal roosts. Whereas smaller species like the Eurasian tree sparrow roost almost exclusively in these communal roosts and these big social aggregations. So in conclusion, where do snakes forage and where do birds roost? We found that birds roost almost exclusively in these sort of urban refugia, but snakes also tend to forage there. And so beyond that, at a smaller sort of spatial scale, it seems that Såli in particular are using microhabitat avoidance and coconut palms. As they age, they seem to learn this, or for whatever reason, they're shifting their microhabitat, and that seems to be helping them escape predation. And then secondly, are birds exhibiting adaptive responses to landscape of fear? We've shown that they are by avoiding the forest, and this is common across all species. And then secondarily, we showed that the sort of communal roosting and social aggregation is likely a landscape of fear response that serves to reduce predation risk. So in summary, we've shown that there both are sort of these spatiotemporal responses and also the spatial variation anti-predator behavior that birds are using to reduce the risk of being eaten by a brown tree snake. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. That's all I've got for you today, and I look forward to the question session. Thank you very much.